Hey guys, for Wednesday and Thursday, we're going to be reading The Honeymaker by Gail Gibbons. And one thing we know about Gail Gibbons is that not only does she write her books, but she also illustrates them. She's the same author that we were studying on Monday who wrote The Penguins. It is springtime. Two beekeepers have placed a beehive on a hill. Activity begins around the hive. The honeybees and the beekeepers are the honeymakers. That's the title of the book, The Honeymakers. Who are the honeymakers? It's the beekeepers and the bees that are the honeymakers. Honeybees traveled to and from the hive. Their earliest ancestors lived about 80 million years ago. The scientific name for honeybee comes from the Latin words apis mellifera, meaning honey bearer. Honeybees are social creatures. They form highly structured groups called colonies. In a colony, as many as 50,000 or more bees live together and work at their own special jobs. So a colony is a group of animals that live and work together. And if you considered us animals, you could say that we live and work together and we all have different jobs. So it's kind of like we're very similar to the bee in the fact that we have our own colonies. Many honeybees like to make their homes in dark and closed places. Often a colony of wild honeybees builds its hive in a hollow tree. Honeybees, cared for by today's beekeepers, live in box-shaped wooden hives. Inside the beehives, the honeybees, are building an amazing structure called a honeycomb. It's made up of countless six-sided cells. Stored in many of these wax cells is the food that bees and people love to eat, honey. Remember what a six-sided figure is called? Kind of rhymes with six. If you said hexagon, you are right. These bees are making hexagons. 3 different kinds of honeybees live inside all beehives. There is one queen, about 100 male drones, and thousands of female worker bees. Like all insects, bees have 3 body parts. There is a head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Honeybees have other parts too. The queen is the largest of the honeybees, and she can live the longest, from about 3 to 5 years. All the other bees in the colony live for about 2 months, except over winter when they live a few months longer. It is the queen's job to make sure the hive never runs out of bees. To do this, she leaves the hive to mate with her drones. Then she lays as many as 2,000 eggs a day. Drones are usually smaller than the queen. Their only job is to mate with her. Most cells in the beehive are used for storing honey, but some are used for the queen to lay her eggs. These are called brood cells. In each brood cell, the bee will develop and grow. The largest brood cells are queen brood cells, also called royal cells. Drone brood cells are smaller. Even smaller are the worker brood cells. The eggs in those cells will become worker bees. Although all worker bees are female, they do not lay eggs. Instead, they do the work of the beehive. And trust me, there's lots of work to be done. Most eggs the queen lays are no bigger than the period at the end of this sentence. After 3 days, a larva hatches from each one. For the next 3 days, worker bees called nurse bees feed the larva bee milk. Then they feed it bee bread. A queen larva is fed royal jelly throughout its growth. Each larva grows quickly, then spins a silky cocoon around itself. Inside the cocoon, a pupa develops. A nurse bee seals the cell with wax. I want you to see all of these pictures. Little by little, the pupa changes. It begins to look more like an adult insect. This process is called metamorphosis. Queens develop in about 16 days from the time the eggs are laid. The metamorphosis of drones and workers takes about 21 to 24 days. Finally, after the transformation is complete, an adult bee chews its way out of the brood cell, an adult honeybee. This honeybee is a worker bee. From the minute she comes out of her brood cell, she is as busy as a bee. For the next 3 weeks, she will have a number of different jobs to do inside the hive. First, she's a house bee, cleaning and polishing the cells. About 3 days later, she becomes a nurse bee. After 10 days of being a nurse bee, she becomes a wax-making bee. She makes flakes of wax in her abdomen and chews them to mold new ones or repair old ones. Wax-making bees are also in charge of storing the nectar and pollen that other honeybees bring back to the hive. Other workers care for the queen. They are her court. They cluster around the queen to continually feed and groom her. Must be nice to be the queen bee. About a week later, the wax-making bee becomes a guard bee and begins its outdoor life. Guard bees protect the hive. They chase away any intruders with their stingers. They also alert the other bees by spreading a special scent when there is danger. A guard bee will sometimes die in battle to protect the hive and its honey. The worker bee is now about 3 weeks old. She is ready to become a forager bee, her last job, but a very important one. Forager bees are the bees you see zipping from flower to flower. They collect sweet juices called nectar from the flowers for honey making. At each flower, the forager bee collects nectar with her proboscis. She stores the nectar in a special part of her body called the crop, or honey stomach. This stomach is separate from her other stomach. As she goes from flower to flower, she comes in contact with a yellow powder called pollen. Some of the pollen is collected in little baskets formed by the special hairs on her hind legs. As the forager bee collects nectar, she carries pollen from flower to flower. This is part of a process called pollination. When she has visited many flowers and her crop is full, she beelines it back to her hive. That means she hurries back, doesn't waste any time. I want you to stop the video here and ask your parents about pollination and how important it is. Back inside the hive, the forager bee brings up or regurgitates the nectar. Then she transfers it by tongue to a hive bee. The nectar is passed by tongue among the hive bees until some of its moisture is gone. Then a wax-making bee places the nectar in a honey cell. There it continues to dry. More and more nectar is added to the honey cell. House bees cluster over the cell and fan their wings to evaporate even more of the moisture in the nectar. As the nectar loses water, it becomes thicker and thicker. Finally, wax-making bees cap or seal the cell with wax. Slowly, the nectar ripens into honey. When forager bees return to their hive, they have a special way of telling the other forager bees of important discoveries, like a new location of flowers full of nectar or pollen. They do the dances of the bees. That's how they communicate. A forager bee can visit up to 10,000 flowers a day. All the nectar she collects in her entire life can make only about 1 teaspoon of honey. To make 1 pound of honey, it takes nectar from over 1 million flowers. Can you imagine? Also, different kinds of honey come from different kinds of flowers. That tells us about the dances of the bees. Honeybees have always been valued for the honey they make. For thousands of years, people have stolen honey from wild beehives. People became beekeepers when they began to make their own hives. Some used hollow logs, others used clay pots. Later, in about 1500, European beekeepers started using upside-down basket hives called skeps. Then, in about 1850, the hanging, movable frame beehive was invented. On top of the hill is a modern beehive. The beehive is stacked in sections. In each section hang about 10 wooden frames where the bees build their honeycomb. To help the bees build their honeycomb faster, the beekeeper places wax foundations in the frames. It's time for the beekeepers to harvest the honey. The honeybees have had several months to build and fill the honeycomb. The colder the winter, the more food they will need. The beekeepers move slowly around the hive. They wear special clothes and use special equipment to protect themselves from getting stung. But ask my brother, who's a beekeeper, and he tells us it doesn't always work. He gets lots of bee stings. Back at home in a shed, the beekeepers use a hot knife to cut the wax caps off the honey. Then the honeycomb frame is placed inside an extractor. It spins around at a high speed to remove the honey without breaking the honeycomb. The honey goes into a collecting tank. Next, the honey is filtered through a screen and a cloth to remove small pieces of wax. Then the honey is placed in airtight jars. Sometimes beekeepers melt down old and damaged honeycomb to make beeswax candles and other things. The rest of the empty honeycomb frames are returned to the hive for the honeybees to fill again. For some beekeepers, honey making is a hobby. They use the honey themselves or give it away as gifts. Commercial beekeepers provide stores and shops with gleaming jars of their products to sell. Delicious, sweet honey from the honeymakers. The end. Friends, if you have some honey at home, why don't you give it a taste? Try it on a piece of toast or maybe a biscuit or something like that. Honey is delicious, and it comes straight from our honeymakers. Friends, please listen to this video both on Wednesday and on Thursday, and enjoy your week.